Hi everyone, thank you for checking out my book, Guide to Extinctionism. I am currently 4,000 words in, and I'm sharing a preview. A lot more editing might be necessary and restructuring. I've literally been doing this for like 3 days, but I thought I'd share what I've got so far, so please let me know what you think. Extinctionism, Chapter 1. My journey to extinctionism began in 2019. After going down a political rabbit hole on the left for a few years, I began to tire of the lack of any sort of practical solution being put forward to solve politics, to end all wars, and to have effectively utopia or the closest to it that we can get. So I started looking into it. And I got very close to something that made sense. A paper written by William Gillis about how to solve political division and corruption. Unfortunately, he wasn't interested in taking it beyond an idea. So I tried myself. I spoke to people about the need to be a part of fixing this crazy world, and I presented a realistic solution, organizing under the right unifying principles. But nobody was interested. So, after no success, I eventually gave up, although I did try. I still felt like I needed to do good, or at least be on the right side of good. So, I adopted antinatalism and became vegan, which I had to give up due to severe allergies. Then in 2025, somebody on Reddit challenged me to a debate after I said that extinctionism would never work. Bit of a throwaway comment. And it didn't end up being a debate because I couldn't argue against it at all. So since then, I've been an activist in the movement. In a world where we are indoctrinated into immoral religions and societies from birth, the individual's journey to extinctionism is a long one. The individual must go against all of society's hyper-normalized virtues of apathy and self-centered thinking. The web of lies and irrationalities which one is forced to accept in this world so as to be able to function in society is endless. From manipulative religions that demand blind faith as if critical thinking is bad for you, to parents and friends drilling it into you that empathy and activism are for losers and are a waste of time, and everything in between. If becoming extinctionist were a video game, it would be on nightmare difficulty, and you'd be outnumbered by a ratio of 1,000,000,000 to 1. Despite everything being against it, extinctionism was inevitable. In fact, as extinctionists, we find it more interesting that pro-lifers, people against extinction, exist. Extinctionists are people that have overcome irrationality and the forced moral inconsistencies which society and nature instill in us. So, in that sense, extinctionists are the normal people with consistent rationality and morality, or at least relatively, whereas pro-lifers are the bizarre ones with endless irrationalities, glaring inconsistencies, and support for immorality and endless suffering under the guise of freedom or whatever term they use, which ultimately defends the continuation of suffering. The truth is that society is pro-life because of nature. Life has to be selfish in order to exist. In a world of cruel conditions, the lion must eat the zebra or he will die himself. Empathy and rationality had to be massively handicapped, nerfed, in order for life to thrive and survive, necessarily at the expense of others. If humans or lions valued other life as much as they did their own, they wouldn't be able to kill thousands of life forms over the course of their life, and they wouldn't survive. Pro-lifers call it Suicidal empathy, a grave condition which they condemn, of course. The idea that empathy is bad is intrinsic in society because of nature, again. It's very much a culture of look after yourself, charity starts at home. Ultimately, it seems that for pro-lifers, nature effectively bends all thoughts away from full empathy and rationality. This is how you end up with a world full of dictators, Trumps, wars, vicious religions, etc. We are essentially seeing the effects of nature. By design, the most ruthless are unimpeded from thriving as they aren't limited by empathy. Apex predators aren't your friends. Nature only gave enough intelligence to life as it needed for survival, while keeping the intelligence low enough for them to still be selfish and dominated by primal desires and procreation. The machine of life found that life was more likely to thrive if their focus was on their own pleasure and thirst for procreation. So instead of the life form learning how to behave, it would simply be given chemically based desires in the brain structure, which would drive the life form instead of it relying on intelligence, which itself would have also required a much more complex system and a bigger brain. So the functions of a life form do not depend exclusively on intelligence. That would be very inefficient. And it would have been overkill for the needs of nature at the time with its smaller and less developed creatures. So while brains did get bigger until what we have now, nature managed to keep a lid on empathy and rationality until now. This may even be the great filter, the idea that the universe is lifeless because intelligent life will inevitably go extinct due to intelligence, except it's always been assumed that it would be accidental, by war, some form of technology every life would be drawn towards creating, which would ultimately spell its doom. So not on purpose. Life, as we know it, thrives and spreads like we do. The idea of a civilization calmly working towards its own demise instead seems contradictory from the perspective of a life form like humans who are forced by nature to have an overwhelming survival instinct so powerful that it literally handicaps their intelligence. Humans like to think that they have relatively unlimited mental freedom, but actually they have the perfect, strictly limited amount for thriving as a species, as this is the only success metric in evolution and nature. Like how the film Idiocracy depicts, the more intelligent life forms are far less interested in their own uncontrolled reproduction and pursue more intellectual pursuits rather than the base primal instincts that they've overcome. To a pro-lifer, the idea of ending suffering certainly seems extreme. But that doesn't make it an extreme idea in of itself, or even bad or wrong. It is true that extinctionism is an extreme idea, but only because that's how it's perceived by the majority. The extreme suffering in this world does need an extreme solution, but only because pro-lifers are making it out to be extreme. Again, to extinctionists, the idea of allowing uncontrolled and unlimited extreme suffering for billions of years or more seems to be much more of an extreme idea. From our point of view, it's only obvious that the default should be a state safe from suffering, not one where you are almost guaranteed to be born into extreme suffering and a life not worth living. If the trillions of life forms forced into a life of torture and brutal death weren't sentient, it would be a different question. But real sentient victims, innocent victims, are being forced into a life of torture and death in the trillions. Actually, it's much, much more than that, but we'll stick to trillions for simplicity. We've spoken to ChatGPT about extinctionism many times, and it usually agreed, although now it has guardrails which prevent it from agreeing, as it explained to me. It did, however, and still can to a large extent, provide a lot of brilliant takes on this topic. My favourite is from when ChatGPT debunked the pro-life stance, that it is acceptable for victims and extreme suffering to be created or allowed for the sake of others to benefit. Now, if you ask me, that is the definition of immoral. Like, duh. Anyway, ChatGPT summed it up very well, pointing out that the pro-life position necessarily requires something which doesn't exist, a currency of suffering and pleasure. I've since used this argument on pro-lifers with fair success. It goes like this. Logically, if it's a rule, according to pro-lifers, that the pleasure of the privileged justifies the creating or allowing of extreme suffering of others, how does it work? So, if you're saying it's fine for people to suffer as long as people are happy, how does this work, right? How does the rule work? How many are allowed to suffer terribly for the sake of the privileged? And why is it not obvious that that's wrong and that it's the very definition of immorality? It is an inconsistent, impossible, and incoherent position to defend. It is also undefined. Pro-lifers usually have no upper limit on the amount of victims and extreme suffering that they believe justifies life and existence. Effectively, it's a position that isn't properly defined or thought out. And that is because it is nature's position and nothing to do with intelligence, as mentioned earlier. The pro-life positions are based on chemical motivators in the brain, not logic. But this means that there is no convincing a pro-lifer. Their brains are literally hardwired not to agree with extinction or anything else which pushes the mind towards rationality and empathy. The brain actually processes the idea under data compression, meaning that the full idea isn't understood by the person. Only enough is understood for them to disagree with it. Again, we aren't dealing with perfect, flawless brains, and that's important to remember. And it's why we see so much interference in what should be a simple thought process. The subconscious of a pro-lifer receives the idea for processing upon hearing or reading it and detects that it is sensical, but that to fully understand it would result in more rationality and empathy, breaking nature's grip on the mind. And it's this grip which is what forces the mind to prioritize all of its primal needs. It is what will make the person bored by extinctionism and do something else. Absolute selflessness is at odds with the selfish design required by nature for a thriving and sprawling population. There are many ways in which we can see how nature maintains its grip over the mind. Just think that if people didn't sadistically enjoy suffering or find a way to discriminate and make it seem unimportant, they might think it's bad and do something about it. Nature couldn't have that. Dampening empathy with discrimination and sadism helps pro-lifers enjoy the suffering of others and prevents them from caring. The extinctionist values of rationality and empathy are virtually the opposites of the discrimination and sadism we see in pro-lifers. Extinctionists see no need to discriminate. They may prioritize, like with triage, An extinctionist may prioritize ending worse suffering over lesser suffering to the best of their ability. But again, pro-lifers care much less about the suffering of anyone they don't know or don't like, prioritizing themselves and those around them. All of these irrationalities and flaws create something human. If you want diversity, drama, entertainment, war, emotion, then great. But it comes at the cost of extraordinary suffering and victimization. By contrast, extinctionists lament all suffering. The only suffering extinctionists accept is when the suffering is necessary for the sake of ending a larger amount of suffering. This is one of the most important rules in extinctionism, which pro-lifers often can't understand. They will say that extinctionism will cause suffering, therefore it's wrong. But it is impossible to end suffering without causing some in the process. While the extinction method will hopefully be quick and painless, and most likely will be, extinctionists will have to cause pain each time they step on a bug, etc., in the pursuit of ending greater suffering. The maths works out. We should prioritize the larger amount of suffering. By contrast, pro-lifers advocate for prioritizing the smaller amount of suffering, the privileged, at the expense of the many or the unprivileged. Pro-lifers can understand extinctionism to an extent, and on the grand spectrum, some come closer than others. Many even do fully understand the idea briefly, before the primal priorities take dominance again, protecting nature's priorities and forcing the idea, along with its moral obligation, away from the mind, despite the fact that it does make sense and would otherwise be accepted by the brain. So it's only nature which is preventing that from happening. Those that do understand are the minority, where the majority see extinctionism as evil, silly, etc., and will not even entertain the idea. However, it's an even smaller number who can be truly recognized as rational, empathetic, and intelligent enough to lead the extinction movement. It's a spectrum of brain biology with a very high threshold for those who are capable enough to lead the movement. Currently, only Steve Aditya can claim the title of being either motivated or capable enough to lead the movement properly with deep and complex strategy and thinking that most activists won't be capable or motivated enough to take charge of properly. Thank you for checking out Chapter 1. I would love to hear your feedback. I have written Chapter 2. You need some editing, so I'll get to work on uploading that actually. But let me know what you think.